Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other Mormon faiths. I'm Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, and I oversee our faith coverage. Before we start, a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com/MormonLand. That is patreon.com/MormonLand, and click on Become a Member. For as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. And now for today's episode. Latter-day Saint Jenna Carson was a student at Harvard Divinity School when, she said, God called her to become a military chaplain. That was 2015, and although Carson did not know it, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did not at that time grant women the all-important endorsement required by the Defense Department. Female Latter-day Saints could obtain endorsements to serve as chaplains in hospitals, education, hospice care, and even prisons, but not, it turned out, the military. Nevertheless, the feeling persisted, and so did she. Setbacks followed, but in 2021, she got Salt Lake City's go-ahead. The next year, she was on her way to boot camp. 2 years into being an Air Force chaplain, Carson has more than a little to say about what it's like to be a female spiritual authority operating, if not within the LDS Church, then with its approval. Jenna, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Glad to have you here. Okay, so to start, tell us where do you serve as chaplain and what are the responsibilities and day-to-day tasks of a chaplain?
I currently serve at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I'm in the Air Force, as you said. So the day-to-day life really varies depending on the needs of the units that I serve and different mission readiness, as we say in the military. So a lot of days I'm spending quite a good amount of time counseling people. So in the Department of Defense, military chaplains have 100% confidentiality, which is incredible. I don't know any other institution that can grant that to its chaplains. And so people in the military tend to really trust the chaplains and come to us and tell us the deep, dark secrets, the things that they have told nobody else. And so I do spend a lot of time counseling. I also spend time advising military leadership, so attending staff meetings with commanders and providing a brief leadership spiritual thought and advising on the morale of the units that I serve. I also spend a lot of time in organizing what we call resiliency activities, so supporting our service members who go through quite a lot during their military service. I provide invocations at retirement ceremonies and other military ceremonies. So it really varies day to day.
Mm-hmm. So now, to be clear, you're not just a chaplain to Latter-day Saints. How do you manage like the interfaith element of being a chaplain? And is that ever tricky?
I love the interfaith aspect. That's why I was so drawn to chaplaincy. I don't work with Latter-day Saints often. I do work with them, but more so people from all different backgrounds or no faith background, no religious background. It could be tricky. I don't see it as tricky because I really, truly deep down inside me believe in pluralism, and I am 100% behind this aspect of my job, that my role is not to proselytize. I know historically that can be hard for some chaplains, but for this chaplain, for me, it's not hard. I did that. I did that on my LDS mission. Now as a chaplain, I am responsible to meet people where they are and to try to understand how they make meaning in their lives. So it is a privilege and a joy. It's a joy to be entrusted with people's stories and their sacred backgrounds that they come and express to me.
Can I ask, what are some of the more profound experiences you've had to date where you felt like, oh, this is why God wanted me to do this?
That's a good question. The moments when I feel that I'm doing exactly what God has called me to do are usually very sacred times when people have just revealed a lot of information about what they've been through in their life. And I feel that I have a lot of empathy, particularly as a woman hearing specific women's issues. Also, though, I've been surprised at how deeply I've connected with the men who come to me and share their struggles as well. I've had men say things like, "You're a spiritual authority. If you tell me what to do, I will do it." And I very rarely tell people what to do. It's not the prerogative or responsibility of a chaplain to tell people what to do. That would be really spiritually irresponsible to dictate what people should do. But just to see the amount of trust that people have in me as their chaplain really amazes me. And in those sessions, I'm praying, I'm asking God what is needed, what should be said, what shouldn't be said. And it's just really special to feel like there's this co-creation with the divine and with the individual who is coming to me for counseling.
It's interesting you bring up the I think the phrase you said, spiritual authority, that the people in the military, how they view you. Women, of course, lead in a variety of capacities in the LDS Church, your faith, but are not ordained to offices of the priesthood, and thus they're kept outside of the main decision-making structure and hierarchy. What's it like to you as a woman to move between these two spaces, your military work, where you're the spiritual authority, and then your LDS community and worship, where you don't have those kinds of powers, I guess you could say, or authority? What's that like?
It feels a little bit like whiplash. So Sunday morning, I'll be preaching and actually leading a congregation, a non-denominational Protestant congregation on the military base. I do that in the morning, and then I will drive to my LDS ward and sit in the pew. And in some ways it's a relief because I know I don't need to do anything. I just get to sit back while the young men serve me the sacrament, and the bishopric, they lead the congregation. So in some ways it's a relief after having been the leader in the morning. In other ways, it's just really strange. Like, you can't unsee it after being the woman running the show, like the church service in the morning, and then going to my own church service and seeing the men do it all. It's just a strange thing to observe. So yeah. I can't see it now.
Yeah, even physically, I would think you walk into the chapel and you think, I was just a few hours before up front. Mm-hmm. And now you're sitting in the pews, as you say, and very often there are no women on the stand, right?
Yes. Yes.
So what's that like? I mean, could you tell me a little bit more about what that feels like? Do you feel left out? You say you feel a bit relieved. You don't have to do some of the things you had to do before, but.
Well, it feels like an injustice. It feels wrong to me. It feels like this is a structure that has been created by men. And on Sunday, it was interesting. A member of the High Council in the region of the LDS Church, he was there. And the bishop had been sitting up front with one of his counselors. The other counselor was out of town. And at some point, the stake president walked in and he took the main seat. And then the sacrament was served, and the sacrament went to him first, because it always goes to the high up leader first, and then the bishop, and so on. But what was so striking to me is when the high councilman got up to give his talk, his sermon, the first thing he said, "You'll notice that the stake president came in late because he had another commitment, but then he was served the sacrament first." And he said, "Our church is a church of order." And I was so perplexed. I was like, okay, we're in church. My understanding is that your job is to give us an uplifting sermon that focuses on Christ. But the first thing that you say at the pulpit is that our church is a church of order, and that the high-ranking male who walks in the room will be served the sacrament first. I just found it really socially interesting because I've attended a lot of churches, and I love attending a lot of different churches. I lead different churches, and I can't think of any time in any of those churches where a leader would get up and make a point for the whole congregation to notice who got to take the sacrament first. And as a woman, the thought is, that's interesting because it's always going to be a man. It will always, in the LDS Church, it will always be a man. And so there's definitely some cognitive dissonance for me to see how my church is run versus how other churches that I operate in have our, the way we manage congregations. Mm-hmm. So it just seems to me that Jesus would be focusing on something else.
So many of our listeners may not know, but you're a bit of a trailblazer, of course. You were the first Latter-day Saint, I believe, man or woman, to be a chaplain in the federal prison system. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so what was that like? What did you do with that? And how does it compare to your duties in the military?
So in the Federal Bureau of Prison, I was in a men's prison. And so that was different because my congregation was all men. And so I remember the first time I got up to lead the congregation, it was such an ironic thing, like a Latter-day Saint woman being the spiritual authority in a room full of dozens of men. And I had never led a congregation before. So this was my first time doing it. And so I was so nervous. I was like shaking as I was welcoming the men into this really austere prison chapel. It wasn't really a chapel. It's like a large, we made it a chapel, but it doesn't look like a chapel. It's a large classroom with tiled floor and white concrete walls and these glaring fluorescent lights. And so I'm welcoming the men in and I'm just praying. I'm like, help me, God. And then when I started, we sang and we prayed. And then when it was my turn to preach, to really lead, to really bring the word of God in a way that I had never had to do as an LDS woman. No one had ever asked me to lead a congregation or to preach the one sermon that everyone would go away with. When it came time for me to speak, I'll never forget like opening my mouth and feeling like I just had this download from God of knowing exactly what to say, exactly how to preach. I left my sermon notes at the pulpit and I was weaving about my congregation, interacting with the men. And it was just this unleashing of spiritual power that I had never experienced in my church. So it was incredible. It was truly incredible. And I think that's when I really started realizing like there's something going on here with this idea of priesthood power that is taught in the LDS Church. Like, I think I understand now what it feels like. And it's almost like priesthood power in some ways, I think, is in the eye of the beholder. So like those men saw me as a spiritual authority. And I think because of that, and because God was with me, I started to lean into this understanding, oh, like women really do, like we can do this.
Yeah. I'm envisioning this. It's almost like if you put in LDS context, what you did, it would be like a Relief Society president going and speaking before a priesthood body, right, of men in the LDS Church, right? and leading the group.
And being taken seriously.
Exactly.
Taken seriously. And that's what's so interesting is I don't yet see that in the LDS Church. I don't yet see women being taken as seriously in our spiritual ministry as men. And I think that's something that, I think we have a responsibility to consider that.
I think that's interesting when you talk about priesthood and your understanding. So how has your understanding of priesthood evolved through your work?
Yeah, well, in the LDS Church, when we become chaplains, we are set apart by a general authority. So we have a special laying on of hands blessing. And so the elder who gave me my blessing, before he gave me the blessing setting apart, he encouraged me to study priesthood. He was telling me, like, study priesthood, use it in your work, which was so cool because no man in the church had ever said, Jenna, go study and use priesthood. Well, let me actually amend that. President Nelson has started saying that to women, but it was so cool to be like told to do that. And I think my quote study of priesthood has really come through experience. Like, so my understanding has really shifted. I think I used to have this very exclusive understanding of what it means. And now I lean toward the priesthood of all believers. So I think that if we're going to define priesthood as God's power, then I think anyone who is aligning with God and seeking to serve God has access to priesthood authority. That's just my experience seeing it and living it. So I've definitely gotten more comfortable claiming that and kind of leaning into that role.
So you correctly point out the church has done some reexamination on the question of women and priesthood power. If you remember speaking in March, Annette Dennis of the Relief Society Presidency said that all women who have made covenants in the faith temples are, quote, endowed with priesthood power. She followed this up by saying there is no other religious organization in the world that I know of that has so broadly given power and authority to women. Now, those remarks became somewhat controversial, of course, but what did you make of that when she said those words at that time, and what do you make of it now, given your experiences?
So actually, Dave, when she said that, I know it was very offensive for a lot of women, and I truly respect that. I'm just going to be very transparent that when I heard that, I was actually deeply touched. Because we do have this practice of this endowment. And I think it's very beautiful. I think the disconnect is what happens outside of the temple. So like inside of the temple, yes, women are endowed with this priesthood power, but how does this actually play out in our day-to-day lives? And so I think my question is around like the rhetoric that we use. So it's still very common in our church to call men, quote, priesthood holders. And I actually really struggle with that term because, first of all, I don't believe anyone holds on to God's priesthood. Like, I think anything we do by the grace of God is a gift. And Scripture tells us like the Spirit moves as it will, and we can't really control that. So I just wish we would abolish that term and just talk about men and women partnering with God and being graced with priesthood power to enable us to do what God calls us to do.
Do you feel that you agree to those words a little differently because of what you've experienced too?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. I feel compelled to ask, Jenna. Do you favor women being ordained in the LDS Church?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's something that I hope we as members are praying about and considering. I've never been one to feel that I've just never like wanted ordination personally until I was seeking endorsement by my church to become a military chaplain. That's when I was like, please, just anything to give me the endorsement. I think maybe a question that we ought to be asking is how to redefine our idea of power so that no one is left out of that. There's this quote I love by Mary Beard. She said, "We have to be more reflective about what power is, what it is for, and how it is measured. To put it another way, if women are not perceived to be fully within the structures of power, surely it is power that we need to redefine rather than women." And so my question is, how are we defining priesthood? How are we defining ordination? And can women answer God's call fully? Can we fully serve Jesus Christ without ordination? Can we grow into a fullness of creative energy, spiritual energy, and power with God without ordination? Perhaps, but there are a lot of things that will need to change in our church culture in order for women to actually grow into an understanding of equality with men. And I think for men to be able to see women as equals.
You know, you've talked about this before, about a more passive versus active involvement in a worship setting and the role spiritual authority plays in that. What do you think is the spiritual consequence of being placed in a more passive role versus a more active role?
Oh, there are grave consequences. I think my whole life being taught, and this was truly the language when I was endowed in the temple at age 21, that I turn to my husband, I obey my husband turns to God. And so the husband was the advocate. And that's, in my opinion, that's poor theology. A rich theology is that Jesus is the advocate with the Father. In our case, we also have a mother God. Mm-hmm. But I think that passivity harms both men and women. The passivity of women, because it's irresponsible to put so much pressure on men to perform and to have access to God that women don't. It just puts a lot on men. And I've seen this. I've seen men just feel so overwhelmed with this responsibility that it's easier to just shut off and numb. And then for me as a woman, I know I always thought I need to be led by my future husband. Even before I had a husband, this was the idea, this man is going to complete me and I'll answer to him as he answers to God. And so that led me to not lean into a fullness of ministry. And so now that I have reworked that belief and understand the authority of women, I take a more active role in creating my life with God. And so rather than me think, I have to wait for someone to tell me what to do, I can come up with my own creative solutions, just like I'm expected to in every other role in my life. I'm expected to be a grown woman and make decisions and own them. And so I think that if women can take a more active role in our church communities, then everyone will be lifted together.
So, Jenna, a last question. What's the future hold for you? Do you have any other ambitions? How long do you foresee you serving as a chaplain in the military? What are your dreams and aspirations beyond this?
Great question, Dave. I'm really working to discern that right now. I'm praying on it. I'm thinking on it a lot. I have 1 year left of active duty service, and then I can either separate from the military or switch to the reserve, which is more of a part-time role, or continue in active duty. I'm not sure, but what I do feel sure about is that I know I'll forever be a chaplain, in some capacity. I still have such a heart for the incarcerated. I would love to return to some form of prison chaplaincy or work with formerly incarcerated individuals. I've been writing a book. I currently have a literary agent, so hopefully that will get published. A friend and I have started a podcast. We're going to start running retreats for women to support women in their spiritual, physical, and emotional health. So there are a lot of fun things brewing. I just need to see how it all unfolds.
Yeah. One more question. After you became a military chaplain, I think there were a wave of women that started looking at that, right? I mean, if I remember from our previous stories.
Yes. So it's been really exciting. I think women are really excited about this possibility as a career, and the chaplaincy department at the LDS Church headquarters is growing. So, last year, Dawn Dimmick became our first Latter-day Saint female Army chaplain. Just recently, Sierra Larson, she became a chaplain in the reserve in the Air Force. We have a woman getting her master's degree so that she can become a Navy chaplain. So the only thing is that people have to get that Master of Divinity. And so, it's just taking a little while for women to finish their education, but I think we have much more to come for Latter-day Saint female military chaplains.
Well, Jenna Carson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dave.
And be well, okay?
Thank you. You too.
And thanks to producer Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.